Welcome to another deep dive. Today we're going to be talking about Herdorf. Um, Specifically, we're going to be uncovering kind of a hidden chapter of its history.
Yes.
The forced labor system that was in place at the Fuesseberg-Friedrich Wilhelm mine
Yeah.
during World War II.
Yeah.
We've got a lot of great sources for this one, archives and research papers, but also personal accounts that really just paint such a powerful picture.
Yeah, it's a story that I think goes beyond statistics. We're going to be looking at the lives of real people that were really just caught in this machinery of the Nazi regime.
Right, exactly. And we're going to kind of see how this one mine became this kind of microcosm of the larger system of forced labor in Germany.
Right.
A system that relied on literally millions of people to fuel the war effort.
Yeah.
And often, treated them brutally to get that fuel.
Yeah.
So to kind of set the scene, let's talk about the scale of forced labor in Germany.
Sure.
We know it was widespread, but what are we actually talking about here?
Well, by 1944, there were 8 million forced laborers in Germany.
Wow.
Which is a staggering figure, that represents nearly 25% of the workforce.
25%.
Of the entire workforce. Yeah, it was that just embedded into the German economy at that time.
Wow.
And of course, the treatment varied, depending on the nationality and the status of the laborers.
Right. Okay, so we're talking about this massive system. So where does the Fuesseberg-Friedrich Wilhelm mine, right here in Herdorf, fit into all of this?
Well, this particular mine, owned by Krupp, was heavily reliant on forced labor. Between 1942 and 1945, over 1,000 forced laborers were brought to Herdorf to work in this mine.
Okay, so right in the heart of this town, this is going on. How do we know about the specifics? What kind of sources do we have to shed light on what's happening?
Well, the Rastatt trials. A series of post-war trials that were held by the French provide a lot of insight into this. These trials really focused on war crimes that were committed against forced laborers. And several individuals that were involved with the mine in Herdorf, including its director, Erich Boehne, were actually brought to trial.
Interesting. So these trials weren't just about, individual acts of violence.
Right.
I was reading that they utilized this concept of common design. What does that mean?
Well, common design was a legal principle that they used to really hold people accountable. That may not have, directly committed atrocities, but who played a role in the system, that allowed these atrocities to occur.
Oh, okay. Good.
So it recognizes that a system of exploitation and abuse really requires more than just individual perpetrators to function.
Right. That's an important distinction.
Yeah.
So by looking at these Rastatt trials, we can understand not just those acts of cruelty, but kind of the entire system at the mine.
Exactly, yeah. And we can see how the mine was systematically prepared for the use of forced labor. For instance, simpler mining techniques were introduced, and new infrastructure specifically designed for a less skilled workforce.
Wow. So even before the forced laborers arrived, the mine was being shaped to accommodate them. Kind of chilling to think about.
Yeah.
So who exactly were these laborers that ended up working at the mine?
Well, there were several different groups that were brought to the mine. First, you have the so-called Osterarbeiter. Yeah, which literally means Eastern workers. These were people who were forcibly taken from the occupied territories in the East. Primarily from Ukraine. And brought to Germany to work.
So these were people that the Nazi regime viewed as racially inferior.
Exactly. And they were forced to work against their will.
So the Nazis kind of had this hierarchy, forced labor.
Yes.
And the Ostarbeiters were pretty low on that, huh?
Very low, yeah, because of the regime's racist ideology.
Makes sense. Were there other groups that were brought to Herdorf besides the Ostarbeiter?
Yes. The mine also employed Italian military internees.
So
after Italy surrendered to the Allies in 1943, many Italian soldiers were actually taken prisoner and forced into labor in Germany.
I mean, that must have been a difficult situation for them, forced to work for their former enemy.
Absolutely, yeah. Their experiences really just highlight that complex and really often tragic reality of war and occupation.
Right. And were there any other groups of laborers at the mine? I understand there was a rather unique group. The Russian legionnaires.
Yes.
Can you explain who they were?
Yeah, this is where the story gets really interesting. So the Russian legionnaires were actually Soviet prisoners of war.
Okay.
who had chosen to join the German army.
So these were Soviet citizens fighting for the Germans.
Yes, but their situation was precarious. As the war turned against Germany, the Nazi leadership became increasingly distrustful of these Soviet soldiers who had switched sides.
What happened to them?
Well, they were stripped of their combat roles and sent to work as forced laborers.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a very tragic example of how shifting alliances and really just ideological suspicions could impact people's lives.
And the number of forced laborers at the mine, how did that change over time?
Well, the number steadily increased. By September 1944, there were actually more forced laborers than German workers.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, 1,019 forced labor compared to 719 German workers.
That's a stark statistic.
Yeah.
It really shows just how reliant the mine had become on this forced workforce.
Mm-hmm.
It wasn't just like a supplement.
Right.
It was the primary source.
Yeah.
What about the conditions that these forced laborers faced at the mine?
Right.
I mean, I can't imagine it was very pleasant.
You're right about that. It wasn't. The Rastatt trials really give a chilling glimpse into this day-to-day reality of forced labor at this mine. The testimonies really paint a picture of brutal treatment,
Wow.
inadequate housing,
Okay.
insufficient food, and constant pressure to produce the maximum output, regardless of the physical condition.
Sounds horrific. Can you give us some specific examples of what they endured?
Sure. One witness, a former forced laborer at the mine, testified that they were routinely forced to work until they dropped, even when they were sick or injured.
Jeez.
They described being beaten with rubber hoses, kicked and even struck with mining tools by the guards.
It's barbaric.
It really is. It's a testament to the dehumanizing nature of the system. They were seen as expendable, not human.
It's hard to believe that that kind of cruelty could happen. Right here in Herdorf.
The historical records make it very clear. A doctor who worked at the mine testified the cruelty that he should have treated over 100 cases of injuries that were directly caused by this brutal treatment.
That's heartbreaking. And I was reading that Erich Boehne and others involved with the mine really tried to downplay their role in all this.
Yes.
During the Rastatt trials.
Right. Their defense strategy often involved deflecting blame. They claimed that the poor living conditions were a result of the forced laborers' own lack of hygiene,
Okay.
which they attributed to their cultural background. And they even tried to blame a typhus outbreak on the laborers themselves.
So they were trying to shift blame onto the victims.
Exactly, yeah. It was a cynical attempt to avoid accountability for the inhumane treatment of the forced laborers.
But the witness testimonies contradicted those claims.
Absolutely, yeah. Several witnesses testified that the overcrowded and unsanitary conditions that they were forced to live in were the direct result of the mine's policies, not their own cultural practices.
Right.
They made it very clear that the lack of sanitation, coupled with insufficient food and medical care, created a breeding ground for disease and suffering.
So they were set up to fail.
Oh,
And then blamed for the consequences
yeah.
of that system that was exploiting them.
A very insightful observation, yes.
Wow. And it wasn't just the horrific living conditions.
Yeah.
I understand that there were even cases of forced laborers being executed at the mine.
Sadly, yeah.
Can you tell me more about that?
Sure. The Rastatt trials documented two specific cases of forced laborers who were executed at the mine.
Okay.
And these executions really just offer a terrifying glimpse into the absolute power that the mine authorities had over these people.
Let's talk about these cases. What led to these executions?
Okay. So in the first case, a forced laborer was falsely accused of stealing a key to the explosives chamber.
Oh, wow.
And it turned out that the German foreman had actually lost the key, but the blame was pinned on this laborer.
Really?
And he was handed over to the Gestapo and ultimately executed by hanging based on this false accusation.
It's beyond comprehension that a human life could be treated so casually. What about the second execution?
The second case involved a forced laborer who got into an altercation with a German supervisor.
Okay.
Again, this laborer was handed over to the Gestapo and hanged.
So any perceived challenge to authority,
Right.
no matter how small,
Right.
could have deadly consequences.
That's exactly the point the Nazis wanted to drive home.
Yeah.
Instilling fear and obedience, making it clear that any resistance would be met with brutal punishment.
The testimonies must be heartbreaking.
They are. The police from Herdorf at the time gave an account of seeing the execution truck and the line of forced laborers that were being marched to witness this hanging.
Jeez.
The Nazis deliberately forced the other laborers to watch as this man was executed, to instill terror, to crush any hope of resistance.
Oh, wow. Forcing them to watch the death of their fellow laborer?
It speaks volumes about the brutality of this system.
Yeah. Were there any other details about the executions that came out during the trials?
Yes. Another witness described being prevented from approaching the execution site by a police cordon. So the Nazis clearly wanted to control the narrative surrounding these executions, keeping them shrouded in secrecy and fear.
So these executions weren't just these brutal acts of violence.
Right.
They were a tool to maintain control.
Absolutely.
And spread terror.
They weren't just isolated incidents of cruelty. They were part of a larger strategy of repression and dehumanization.
Right.
Yeah. They served as a very stark reminder of the precariousness of their lives and the absolute power that the Nazi regime had over them. These executions, along with really countless other acts of brutality, just underscore the inhumane reality of this forced labor system. I think it's so easy to get lost in statistics, but we have to remember that these weren't just nameless, faceless workers.
Right. Each one was an individual with their own story, their own hopes. It was all extinguished under the system.
And that's why it's so important to remember the victims as human beings and not just numbers. And the trial records really help us do that, at least to some extent. But the Rastatt trials documented a list of 43 forced laborer deaths at the Fuesseberg-Friedrich Wilhelm mine, listing their names, dates of death, and causes.
Wow. That must be a somber read. Were there any patterns in the causes of death?
Sadly, yes. Tuberculosis and pneumonia were incredibly common, likely exacerbated by the terrible living conditions and the lack of proper medical care.
Right. If you're constantly exposed to harsh conditions and malnourished, denied medical treatment, your body is just much more susceptible to disease.
Exactly. And the trial records also revealed a number of deaths from accidents, which just highlights the dangerous nature of the mining work and the lack of safety precautions for these forced laborers.
It's hard to imagine the despair they must have felt, just trapped in this system with no way out.
And there are even more tragic details. The list includes the deaths of 2 infants.
Oh, wow.
And a doctor who worked at the mine testified that there was actually a directive to force abortions on pregnant Russian women.
It's just layer upon layer of cruelty, a deliberate disregard for human life. It makes you wonder if they even attempted to document the deaths of all the forced laborers.
Unfortunately, no. The trial mentions 12 Soviet POWs who died at the mine, but there's very limited documentation about their fates.
So it's like their lives, their deaths meant nothing to the authorities. The lack of information itself speaks volumes.
It does, yeah. It's a tragic reality. Many of these forced laborers remain nameless, forgotten, their stories lost to history.
So the trials brought to light these horrific events at the mine. But what about the aftermath? Was there any sense of justice served?
The verdicts of the Rastatt trials were unfortunately mixed. Some individuals, including those who were directly responsible for acts of brutality, received lengthy prison sentences, but others, including Erich Boehne, the mine's director, received relatively lenient punishments.
How lenient are we talking? I can't imagine any punishment being sufficient.
Right.
Considering the scale of the suffering.
Yeah. Böhne was sentenced to just 3 years in prison.
Wow.
And a fine of 50,000 Reichsmark, really just a slap on the wrist, compared to the immense suffering that was inflicted on these people under his control.
3 years. It's hard to believe that such a light sentence could be considered justice.
Yeah.
What about the others who were convicted? Did they face any consequences beyond those initial sentences?
Well, after the war, there was a process called denazification aimed at purging Nazi influence from German society.
Okay.
And this process often resulted in the rehabilitation of those convicted of war crimes.
So they served their sentences, but then they were essentially pardoned.
In many cases, yes. There was a strong desire to move on, to rebuild Germany, and that often meant overlooking the atrocities of the past.
Seems like a convenient way to forget, to sweep the horrors under the rug. What about Boehne specifically? Did he face any repercussions?
Well, the attempts to downplay his role and to present him as a victim of circumstance are truly remarkable. There were a lot of efforts to portray him as a capable manager who is simply doing his job, ignoring the suffering inflicted under his watch.
Rewriting history to protect those in power.
Unfortunately, it's a pattern we see too often. And the contrast between Böhne's actual wartime activities and the way he was later portrayed is pretty striking.
Can you elaborate on that? What were some of his wartime activities?
Well, during the war, Böhne was a high-ranking member of the Stahlhelm. Yeah, which was a far-right paramilitary organization with strong ties to the Nazi Party. He was also deeply involved in exploiting resources in occupied Norway, again relying heavily on forced labor.
So he was a committed Nazi who actively participated in the regime's policies.
Yes, and yet after the war, he was able to rebuild his life and career, eventually becoming a respected figure in the German mining industry.
It's almost unbelievable.
It is.
That someone who played such a role in this system could escape accountability and even achieve a level of success in post-war Germany.
And to add insult to injury, Böhne was even awarded the Federal Cross of Merit, one of Germany's highest civilian honors in 1958. It's a stark example of how the past was conveniently ignored in the pursuit of post-war reconciliation and economic recovery.
And how the suffering of those forced laborers was ultimately forgotten.
Sadly, yes. Their stories, their pain, were largely pushed aside as Germany rebuilt itself and moved on. It's a sobering reminder that justice isn't always served. And that the past can sometimes be buried, even when it holds such dark truths.
Yeah, it's a lot to process. You know, we've uncovered the story of exploitation and brutality, attempts to erase the truth right here in Herdorf. It makes you think, what does this history tell us about the town? How do we grapple with such a difficult legacy?
It's an important question. This mine, this story, it isn't just an isolated incident. It's very deeply intertwined with the history of Herdorf. You know, a town whose identity was, and in many ways still is, connected to the mining industry.
Right. So understanding what happened at this mine during the war isn't just about, unearthing this forgotten past. It's about understanding Herdorf itself.
Exactly. Yeah. It challenges us to look beyond the picturesque landscapes and the charming traditions and confront this darker aspect of the town's history. And it raises questions about how a community confronts its complicity in a system of exploitation like this.
It's a reminder that history isn't always, neat and tidy, that even seemingly idyllic towns can have these dark secrets. So what do you think is the most important takeaway from this whole deep dive into the Fuesseberg-Friedrich Wilhelm mine? What should our listener who lives in Herdorf, really consider after hearing all this?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is the human cost of this system. We've talked about numbers and statistics, but behind each data point is a person, a life, a family. And it's about remembering the victims, acknowledging their suffering, and honoring their memory by ensuring that these kinds of injustices are never repeated.
It's a powerful call to action. Remembering isn't just about the past. It's about shaping a more just and compassionate future. And I think that's a perfect note to end on. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into this truly challenging and thought-provoking chapter of Herdorf's history.
Thank you for having me.
And to our listeners, we encourage you to continue exploring this topic, to delve deeper into the history of your town, and to really reflect on how we can all contribute to a world where these kinds of atrocities are never forgotten and never repeated. Because understanding the past is the first step towards creating a better future.